Hey guys, this is Doug May with That Audio Guy. In this video we're going to take a look at modulation in Omnisphere 2. Now modulation can be kind of a tricky concept, especially if you've never had experience using modulation before. So what I'm going to do in this video is use an analogy that will help you understand the idea behind modulation. Again, this is just an analogy, so take it for what it is. I want you to imagine an orchestra with a conductor. Musicians and the players in the orchestra are watching the conductor, and the conductor is guiding or telling the musicians how to behave musically in time. In modulation, you have what's called the modulation source. This can be thought of as a conductor in our analogy. And then you also have what's called modulation targets. These are like the musicians or the players in the orchestra. The target watches the source, and the source tells the target how to behave in time. One example of modulation in Omnisphere is the amp envelope. The envelope itself is the modulation source, and the amplifier or volume is the target. So the envelope is telling the volume how to behave in time, more specifically when I play keys on my keyboard. The filter envelope is another example of modulation. The envelope is telling the filter that we can set up here how to behave in time as well. Probably the most used modulation sources in synthesizers are going to be the envelopes, which we talked about in a previous video, the LFOs, which we will talk about, and then the modulation wheel, which is usually on most MIDI controllers. If you click this drop down tab right here, it contains all of the modulation sources that are available in Omnisphere, and as you can see, there are a lot more than just the LFO envelopes and mod wheel. And then if you click this target tab right here, it opens up this menu which has submenus, and these are all the parameters, the modulation targets that are available in Omnisphere, and you can see that there's a ton of these. In Omnisphere, there are three different ways that you can assign modulation sources to modulation targets. If you right-click on any parameter, and it says modulate right here, then you can assign the source by using this window. If you assign it to an LFO, what it's going to do is assign it to the next available LFO that you haven't already assigned to something else. And it works the same way with these four modulation envelopes. The second way to assign modulation in Omnisphere is by using this modulation window right here. The first tab right here lets you select the source. The second tab right here lets you select the target. And third, you can make assignments in modulation by clicking this magnifying glass right here, and it opens up what's called the Mod Matrix Zoom Window. As you can see, you've got source tabs right here, you've got target tabs right here, and then you can make assignments in the exact same way as before, where you just click here, pick a source, click here, pick a target. Let's take more of a look at the LFOs in Omnisphere. LFO stands for Low Frequency Oscillator. As you can see here, there's 6 different LFO tabs. Each one can have its own waveform, which you can select by clicking this window here, and then it can have its own settings. What happens when you use an LFO as a modulation source is Omnisphere is going to take the waveform that you've picked, and it's going to use that shape to modulate some parameter that you've assigned it to. One example of LFO modulation that we've seen previously is frequency modulation. We saw that this sine wave was being used as a modulation source to modulate the pitch in our sound. The pitch served as the modulation target. In fact, using LFOs in Omnisphere, we can basically make any parameter oscillate in the same way, not just the pitch. Let me give you an example of what I mean. If I turn on the filter right here and then set the cutoff to some point that I want, what I can do is assign that cutoff as a target. So first I'll say LFO1 is the source, and then I'll say filter cutoff as the target. And you can see that this blue line appeared here on the target slider. You can see this white dot right here oscillating along the blue line. This white dot oscillating represents the oscillation of this waveform down here. Let's hear what it sounds like. So you can hear the filter opening and closing, it's oscillating. This is the magic and beauty of using modulation. You don't have to sit here and play with these parameters yourself. You can just assign them to an LFO or some other source, and then they do this action, this behavior on their own. If I change this rate knob right here, you'll notice that the white dot starts oscillating at a higher frequency. Let's hear what that sounds like. This depth knob right here serves as kind of like a mix control. So if we have the depth knob all the way down, you'll hear just the original sound. And then as we turn it up, it starts to introduce the oscillating sound. This delay slider right here determines how long it takes when we play a note to get to this maximum depth that we've assigned right here with this knob. It's similar to the attack on an envelope. One thing to note about this rate is the default is in hertz, which is oscillations per second. If I hit this sync tab right here, it changes these to note values, so you can actually map the rate of your LFO to the BPM in your DAW. Like I said before, you can pick the waveform type you want to use in your oscillation by clicking this window right here. For example, if we pick a square wave, it changes the modulation. Now it sounds like this. You can hear that the cutoff is going from one extreme to the other. It's following the form of this square wave. If we hit this mute button right here, what it's going to do is mute the effect so that we can compare with and without the effect. Makes it really easy. And then if we hit this invert button, what that will do is it will change the modulation source. If we're using a LFO waveform, it'll invert the waveform. This becomes really obvious when we use things like a saw wave. So for example, the inverted saw wave sounds like this. And then when we invert it, it sounds like this. You can hear that it just completely reversed the waveform. Using these LFOs as modulation sources is really nice because they act as automated conductors. We don't have to do any work once we've set it up. But sometimes you want to act as the conductor, and that's where the modulation wheel comes in handy. So the modulation wheel, if we assign that lets us control the cutoff. It makes things more playable if you want to have more control. In Omnisphere, whenever you make a modulation assignment, it'll automatically create this window right here, this modulation window, or it will give you the opportunity to have access to that window. So if you don't see this window pop up, all you need to do is right-click the parameter that you've set up, and then this Show Modulation tab right here, and that'll pull the window up for you. This modulation window contains the exact same parameters as you can see right here in the layer pages. It's really handy because sometimes you'll have parameters that aren't on this page, and so you can make changes to the modulation but then also be in some other page. This source slider can be thought of as the amplitude of the source, or the parameter range that it's going to move through in the modulation. As you watch, when I decrease this, you'll see this blue line right here decrease, and then it increases as I move up on the slider. The target slider lets us determine the center of that range, and in fact, if you watch while I move this target slider, watch this cutoff knob and you'll see that it's moving the cutoff. It's determining the center of that. This smoothing slider right here, what it does is it takes some of the sharper edges on your waveforms and it smooths them out. One thing that I should say about modulation is that you can use the same modulation source for multiple parameters. In other words, I can use LFO1 to modulate the cutoff and the volume and the pan, things like that. This is more easily seen if I come into the Mod Matrix Zoom window. So you can see we've got LFO1 modulating the cutoff. And then I can also assign LFO1 to modulate the pan, for example, and it sounds like this. You can hear it's modulating the cutoff and the pan simultaneously. The Mod Matrix Zoom window is incredibly helpful because it keeps a bank of all your assignments in one place. You can see that we've got all of our assignments right here, the target assignments right here, and then you've got source amount sliders, target parameter sliders, smoothing sliders, and then mute and invert tabs right here. This is a really easy place to not only make assignments but to delete them as well. If I don't want an assignment anymore, I can just click on the tab right here and then hit off, or I can change it to some other assignment that I want. And as you can see in this Mod Matrix Zoom window, you're not limited to just one or two assignments. You've actually got 2 pages full of assignments that you can make. To get to the second page, you just click on this little tab right here and you can go back and forth. That's a total of 24 modulation assignment slots that you can use. So there really is no excuse for you if you feel like your sound isn't quite interesting enough or unique enough. Again, modulation is one of those things that you really need to just play with for yourself. You need to mess around with some of these settings and get an idea of how they work. And I highly recommend that you do that because modulation is such an important part in synth design. You don't even necessarily need to create your own sounds from scratch. What you can do is open patches that come in Omnisphere and then just play around with some of these settings, make a few changes, and you can actually get really cool and unique, interesting sounds from that. That's it, guys, for modulation. I hope that this video helped you better understand how modulation works, and I hope that you have fun with some of these ideas. Stay tuned, you guys. We'll see you in the next video.